Where you just wish I didn't understand exactly what was at play here?
Well, the thing that has always puzzled me about the Trump phenomenon is that he would never have been elected had he not been able to recruit people for whom his policies were just not very good. That shocks a lot of people. But see, these people, they consider their faith first. I wrote the book about the gospel of self, and that's what's really happening is that, they see affluence around them, but in their minds, there's no reason that they can't be affluent one day. So there's that. There's also the consideration from a biblical perspective that Donald Trump is a King Cyrus type. Cyrus was the Babylonian king, the Persian king, who released the Israelites from captivity and let them go back to Jerusalem and build the temple. So I've seen that written in a lot of publications for Christians. Cyrus wasn't a righteous man. I mean, he was a reprobate and pagan. The point is that God used him for good. And so they look at Trump and they say the same thing could be going on here. We just don't know. That's an easy way to dismiss everything because the end justifies the means. And to them, it's Supreme Court justices, it's religious freedoms, it's prayer in schools, it's all those nice morality issues, abortion, same-sex marriage, those moral issues that they find so distasteful and actually, in many ways, consider themselves better than. I think it's amazing that they still cling to that. A great deal of them do anyway. I've noticed a lot of people asking questions, though, but they still cling to all of that. And the most common comment that I hear is just let the guy make his changes. Because they were all in change. What we would view as a major screw up is dismissed by the right wingers because he did promise to drain the swamp.
Even as he fills it up with the same people, Goldman Sachs and millionaires and billionaires who are going to make life a living hell for the people who voted for him.
Well, they don't see it that way, and that's the problem. In order to speak to these people, it has to be a Christian message. And I've been doing a lot of thinking about that. You just won't convince them with rational or secular argument. It has to be from a biblical perspective because that's the only thing they listen to. How about let's just agree that God put Donald Trump in office. But if we agree on that, then we have to also come to agreement that throughout the history in the Bible, where God has done that sort of thing, it wasn't always for the good of the believers. It was often to punish them, disappoint them. And so I think that could be well going on. I think these people believe that God is upset with the culture, but the Bible says that judgment begins at the house of God. So if God is angry with the culture, guess who he holds responsible? Not the culture, but the church. And I think that's an argument that you can win in the circles that these people run. That's one of the things that I'm trying to do by speaking out, by writing the book, and by writing articles, various publications.
What are the church leaders? Are they just winking, saying, okay, we know this guy's not Christ-like. He's a hypocrite. He's done all the things we condemn, but we're going to get stuff and we're just going to manipulate the rubes who are sitting there in the pews? Or do they actually believe that they're vessels of God's will, even if Trump is sinful in a lot of ways, that God is using them? I mean, do they really believe it when you get them alone?
Yes, they do believe it because that's the King Cyrus argument. And it's being used, in many places in the Christian world now. That, yes, his behavior is terrible. Yes, he's the opposite of what we would hold up as Christian. But it doesn't matter because God used King Cyrus and God can use Donald Trump in the same way. That's where you run into a problem with discussing anything. And you have to be able to say, oh, King Cyrus, but he could also be this person, that person, another person, just to throw mud into what appears to be a black and white argument to them. It's fascinating. I think the rise of white nationalism, if I was God, okay, I would say that is an evil that has to be stopped. I have no problem with talking to people about God's will. I tend not to reveal my own opinions or beliefs in that regard so that I can keep the door open to talk with them. If you know the Bible, God knows I've studied it. If you know the Bible and you know especially the places in the Bible to which these people turn for everything, you can make opposing arguments within the scope of the Bible itself. And that's what I'm trying to do. It's hard, but it's actually kind of fun.
How is it that you can have two people looking at the same text coming up with radically different conclusions? I'll give you one that just blows my mind, where you have these folks who have somehow convinced themselves that Jesus Christ is a plutocrat capitalist. And you have other folks like, no, Jesus Christ is a defender of the poor and the meek. Or other folks saying, no. Making money is a sign of God's benevolence. And Trump is a good man because of this. Or the 1% are good people and this is God's will. And the poor are suffering because they're not pious.
What I would say there is that doctrines of the church are all man-made. You may be able to argue the inerrancy of the Bible with me. You can do that, but do not try to argue the inerrancy of man-made doctrine. Either that is fallible or the fall of man never took place. I really kind of look past those kind of things. I'm not a theologian. God knows I have no wish to be. I think you can get so far down tributaries theologically that you end up chasing your tail. One of my favorite books in the Bible, by the way, is Ecclesiastes. It's the book for cynics, written, a lot of people think, by Solomon. And there's great wisdom in there. And it is really a profoundly interesting book. And it runs counter to a lot of arguments that you hear today from Christians. For example, the shit happens verse is in there. The writer says, I've seen all of these things in the world. And one of the mysteries is that the race doesn't go to the fastest. The wealth doesn't go to the man with skill. And he writes all these contradictions. And he says, I conclude that time and chance occurs to everybody. So if time and chance occurs to everyone, that blows a hole in a whole lot of gospel. So in that same book, there are other just wonderful pieces of wisdom too. Like I have seen that, all labor and skill at work comes from man's envy of his neighbor. When you start bringing those things up to Christians who believe that all they have to do is believe in this, that, or the other thing, and creates for a very interesting discussion. I want people to challenge their assumptions. If you want a seat at the discussion table, today or tomorrow especially, you're going to need to be prepared to challenge your assumptions. If you do, you will be a better person for it.
And one of the things that, again, everyone talks around it, but not enough people speak directly to it, and I'm speaking truth to power, that we also have to confront the deep history of racism and white nationalism and the Christian church in this country.
Southern Baptist denomination was formed for one purpose and one purpose only, and that keep the whites from interacting with African Americans. It's tragic. If you believe that the rise of Trump means the death to all that is good and holy, I think you might be missing that maybe some really good can come out of actually putting this crap on the table. And certainly is more and more, and it's every day it's on the table. We can't escape it anymore. And so this great divide, and there are actually many divides in the United States these days. We will never reach our potential as a human species with all of these divides. I think that forcing the issues and putting them on the table so that people actually talk about them, it doesn't necessarily have to end badly. The way it appears right now, the deck seems to be stacked in favor of ignorance. Indeed, to face the ignorance that we've tolerated for so many years about all kinds of things. I'm not talking about IQ. I'm talking about intolerant ignorance about our own kind.
How did you get involved with the 700 Club?
I was working for a TV station in Louisville, Kentucky, WHAS. I was the host and producer of a magazine show that was popular back in the late 70s called PM Magazine. I got this packet in the mail one day from a gal who was going to CBN University, and she was doing a study on magazine show burnout, about what happens to people who produce this kind of program. I filled out the questionnaire and sent it back to her, and she called me the next week and said, you must be a Christian because the way you answer the questions is not like the other people.
So you get the job. Do you have to sit down with Pat Robertson?
The audition reel, if you will, that I sent to that college girl. The first story on it was about a thoroughbred horse photographer in Lexington, Kentucky, the horse capital of the world. I didn't know that Pat Robertson was obsessed with thoroughbred horses. And so that being the first piece on the reel, And the fact that I had done it with just a photographer and myself, they were struggling with how to do that kind of work. And so I really could have written my ticket. The fact that they offered me a job, wasn't really a surprise. At the time that I eventually accepted it, I was out of work. The economy had gone south and I was out of work. So that wasn't the only reason that I went. I was really up for the challenge. I mean, I knew a lot of people think that Ted Turner's gift to television is 24-hour news, but his real gift was that he took graphics production technology and equipment out of the hands of engineers and put it in the hands of artists. And that revolutionized television production on a scale that people really aren't familiar with. It was remarkable. I knew that. I hired a guy from New York who was the godfather of television graphics, and he came in and we built a graphics production facility that was second to none.
See a lot of those techniques, again, connecting the dots, not an accident, with Fox News and how Fox News literally having the ticker at the bottom. That was new. Everything would be an alert, a Fox News alert. Roger Ailes said he wanted to design a station, old white folks, white men in particular, so they can watch politics like sports.
10 years before Fox News, there was CBN News. There was the 700 Club, and their slogan was TV journalism with a different spirit. We pioneered point of view journalism for television. In so doing, because Pat was very, very conservative politically, he was able to blend Republican Party politics, conservative politics with the Bible. And in so doing, he presented a message, a consistent message that you were for Jesus, you were for the Republican Party. And from a journalistic standpoint, our presenting a right-wing version of the news.
And that's CBN's slogan. How did they workshop that? What PR firm came up with that? Because that's genius, too.
You underestimate the marketing genius at CBN. The people who worked there were brilliant. George Gallup was our researcher. So you're talking about some very, very smart people who saw marketing as a way to move people to change, to make changes. And the changes that we wanted people to make was to move from wherever they were to the right. Not only did we move people to the right, we moved the Republican Party to the right. And all of it was built upon a fallacy that it was okay for us to present a right-wing news because everything else was left-wing. It's a fallacy. I don't know how to be more direct about it, but it's just not true. We had no business presenting political propaganda as news. And everybody else was able to, everybody picked up on what we were doing. And Fox News and their fair and balanced, what are they balancing? Well, they claim they're balancing the liberal media. That too is a fallacy.
I'm just trying to paint a picture here. So you're there doing the production stuff, and you have Pat Robertson. It's his child, his brainchild. He's the face that runs the place, as they would say in wrestling. Because you have the money people and the business people trying to get the ratings because ad revenues. How did the true believers, in terms of the faith aspect of this, they just saw this as just a bigger church? How do they reconcile all the money? Did they say, okay, we're doing something here that's dishonest? We're preying on poor people. This is just a means to get the resources to spread the word.
That's a very cynical way of looking at it. I appreciate that, but that's not the way it was. We were trying to change the world for Jesus. I'm talking about a lot of really wonderful, well-intentioned people. That's what we were doing. And so we never did anything that messed with people's faith. We wanted to present this as, you were being faithful. The gospel of self, if you go back and look at Pat Robertson's book, The Secret Kingdom, which he wrote in the early to mid 80s, that's a handbook. That's a self-help book based on the Bible. That's where I started to really have problems with what we were doing, because it's so easy to get caught up in that you forget the other parts of the Bible, like, helping the poor. I had a meeting with Pat when I became senior producer and became responsible for fundraising on TV. I said, Pat, if I'm going to do this, you're going to have to teach me about fundraising. And so we had a lunch one day and we ate and had our pleasantries and then got a pot of coffee and cleared the table away. And he said, write this down. People give to this ministry for these reasons and in this order. How does it help me? How does it help my family? How does it help my neighborhood? How does it help my community? How does it help my state? How does it help my country? And how does it help somebody else? If you look at that, if you diagram that as a target for example. Yourself is dead center. So if you can write a message that appeals to the self, you can raise money. And the last reason people give is so they can help somebody else. I mean, there are a lot of people who will give lip service to that. But the truth is, if you really want to raise money, you got to appeal to the person's self. You got to talk to them in a way that they understand that you are talking to them, and write your message in a way that appeals to their sense of self-worth, their sense of self-growth, their sense of place in the world. So you're talking to their ego, really.
How do we connect the dots from his decision to run for president and where we are today?
He was very effective at creating a shadow government of religious conservatives. That was his message. I mean, he wrote a book about it after he dropped out of the presidential race, saying that his greatest contribution was, raising up people like Sarah Palin. I mean, she's a classic example of a part of the shadow government of the 700 Club, but they're all over the place now. It was a grassroots effort to build the reserves, if you will, for the legislature by creating people at school boards, city councils, then state legislatures, and on up. You would be amazed at the number of people who are in those positions right now. That's why it's been much more effective than people think, because you would think if it had been a top down, all you got to do is identify the top and then you can cut it off. But no, you can't, because this is very much a grassroots thing. And it starts with the message of conservatism and what I would say is actually nationalism now in the suburban churches and the rural churches, but mostly those big, enormous suburban churches where people of means gather and are able to take that message back to their neighborhoods and their friends and so on and so forth. And I think you miss it if you think it's only the rural kind of redneck Christians.
They're the ones with the money, and they're the ones with the political and social capital who are really exerting their influence over the Republican Party. So it's easy to pick on a stereotype of these poor white folks in the South voting against their self-interest.
You need to understand that white Christian nationalists, fundamentalists, people who believe the Bible, and there are a lot of them that fall under that umbrella, and they're not in any one denomination or any one particular church. They're all over the place. And many of them were raised on the stuff that we created at the 700 Club. They are in charge of a large voting bloc. They're not going to be swayed by logical arguments or any of that. It's going to take people from within their own world to help right the wrong.
But do you think it's fair to say that we can draw a more or less straight line from Pat Robertson and the 700 Club to Donald Trump's presidency now?
Absolutely. I don't see how it's possible for it not to be. I think the role of evangelicals in the election of Donald Trump is underestimated. Because he is such a reprobate, people have difficulty or believing that the church could possibly be involved in his election. But I would argue again that they're not looking at it the way the people from the church are looking at it.